Welcome to this conversation with Professor Steve Levitsky on the topic of what it takes to keep democracies healthy. Why Professor Levitsky is an excellent choice for this topic will become clear in my introduction of him. But first, let me explain that this interview is part of the program series entitled Electoral Initiative, which is coordinated by South Carolina Humanities, a not-for-profit organization that provides inspiring, engaging, and enriching programs on literature, history, culture, and heritage for all South Carolinians. The Electoral Initiative series is part of the nationwide Why It Matters civic and electoral participation project administered by the Federation of State Humanity Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And to all we express our gratitude. I'm Ashley Woodowis, Professor of Political Science at Lander University, one of the 4 South Carolina universities to offer programming within the South Carolina Humanities Electoral Initiative. This interview with Professor Levitsky is occurring just 2 weeks after the November 2020 elections, while the embers are still glowing hot and bright. There will be a second live interview with Professor Levitsky, which will occur as a part of this series, and which is scheduled to take place on Monday, March the 8th at 5:30 p.m. You can read the details about this second interview, as well as the complete program details for the Electoral Initiative at schumanities.org. So we're honored to have Professor Levitsky join us today. Steve Levitsky is Professor of Government at Harvard University. His research interests include political parties, authoritarianism, and democratization. The author of numerous scholarly books and academic journals, Professor Levitsky, along with his co-author Daniel Zablot, also of Harvard, achieved national attention for their timely and powerfully argued 2018 work, How Democracies Die, in which the authors examined democracies across time and space to determine why it is that certain democratic regimes slide into anti-democratic authoritarian rule. In the book, and on the basis of their research, they develop a model of the 4 key indicators of authoritarian behavior, and then they apply it to the contemporary American democratic system. They recognize that signs of democratic backsliding had already begun in the 1980s, but for them, it was the 2016 election of Donald Trump that signaled that a critical threshold has been crossed, and that there now exists strong reasons for alarm over the future and fate of American democracy. So to help us make sense of who we are and where we might be heading, we turn now to Professor Steve Levitsky. Professor Levitsky, thank you so much for taking time for this interview.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Recently, you and your co-author, Daniel Zablot, wrote an op-ed for the New York Times entitled In Minority Rule. At the outset, you wrote how the Trump presidency was bringing us to the very threshold of a crisis in democracy, and that was written before the election. Now, 2 weeks after the election, how would you assess our situation?
Well, I don't think this election, as messy and deeply problematic as the last 2 weeks have been, it's a far cry from a worst case scenario. I think I was fearful of violence on election day, and I was fearful of one or more seriously contested elections along the lines of Florida in 2000 that really had to go to the courts, and in which we really did not know who the winner was, and it was up for grabs. That did not occur. Election day was peaceful. The election administration was actually very, very effective. A tremendous amount of credit goes to election workers across and election officials across the country. They did during a pandemic and in a highly charged, polarized atmosphere. They did an extraordinary job, heroic job, and so the election went off reasonably well. And it was a close election, but we have a decisive outcome, and that makes things a lot easier. So I think it was predictable, unfortunately, that Donald Trump was not going to accept defeat, that Donald Trump was going to denounce fraud even without evidence of it, and that he'll probably go off tweeting for months and even years to come about how the election was stolen from him. But he lacks the ability to actually do anything about it. It seems very clear that he is eventually going to have to cede and step aside and allow Joe Biden to become president. So stepping back and looking back in the mindset when we wrote that piece a month or so ago, this was far from the worst case scenario. As messy as it's been, it's actually not too bad an outcome.
Yet in that column, you also set forth a number of reforms that you think are important. Reforms like ending the filibuster in Puerto Rico and DC statehood, among others. All of which you argue will help return America to a majoritarian democracy. Do the election results give you more hope or less hope that those reforms will be accomplished?
I don't think that they're likely to be passed by the incoming Congress. The mixed election result, the fact that Democrats are unlikely to win control of the Senate, and even if they manage to win both Georgia seats, which is not terribly likely, I don't think that they've got the votes to push through these reforms. So the kind of reforms that we were anticipating in that piece, I think would have required a Democratic majority in the Senate of 52, 53 seats, which clearly did not happen. So I think it's very important that we continue to push for those reforms. I think the dangers of minority rule continue to be very, very real, but it's not something that's imminent, those reforms.
For those who haven't read that column, and for those who are watching this, listening to you, can you illustrate what you mean by minority rule? Why is it that a democracy like our democracy, which is based upon majority rule, is actually suffering from what you and your co-author describe as minority rule? Sure.
Look, no modern democracy is fully majoritarian. The majority doesn't get to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants in any democracy. Every modern democracy is a liberal representative democracy that includes some basic protections of individual and minority rights and some degree of checks and balances. So I'm not talking about a pure Athenian majoritarian system. The U.S. system was in some senses always a system of minority rule or of really extreme checks and balances. So the majorities have always had difficulty imposing themselves in the United States. But there's been a particular twist in the last 2 decades that I think is worth noting. So our system was founded in a way, our electoral system was founded in a way that always favored sparsely populated territories, so-called small states. The Vermonts and the Wyomings benefit over the Californias and the New Yorks. This is particularly true in the Senate, where every state gets two senators, no matter how many people. So Wyoming has so much more political power than New York because they have an equal number of senators. But it also affects the Electoral College, which is more mildly biased towards sparsely populated territories, and the Supreme Court, because the Senate ultimately approves Supreme Court nominees. The Supreme Court has a slight bias towards sparsely populated territories. Now, that's always been great for Vermont, and it's always been bad for New York. But it's never had real political or partisan consequences in the past. For 200 years, we had this bias, but it didn't really matter very much because both of our major parties, whatever they were, in the last century and a half, it's Democrats and Republicans. Both parties had an urban wing and a rural wing. Both parties were strong in cities and strong in the countryside. So it rarely seriously benefited one party over the other. Only in the last generation, only really markedly since about the year 2000, has that shifted. We now have an urban-rural cleavage in U.S. politics. The Democrats are overwhelmingly a party of big cities, and the Republicans are overwhelmingly a party of small towns and sparsely populated territories. So through no fault of their own, the Republicans now have a huge leg up in our electoral system. The electoral system is biased towards sparsely populated territories, so it's biased towards the Republicans. That means now that, for example, the Democrats have won the popular vote in 7 out of 8 of the last presidential elections, but the Republicans have governed us for 12 of the last 20 years. There's the data analyst David Shore estimates that Democrats need to win about 54% of the vote regularly if they want to control Congress. Republicans have to win 46, 47% of the vote regularly if they want to control Congress. Biden's going to win this election by about 4 percentage points. He's going to win this election by more than 6 million votes, and yet he actually won by a thumbnail because of the Electoral College, meaning he couldn't win by 2 or 3 percentage points and be president. He couldn't do what George Bush did in 2000 or what John F. Kennedy did in 1960 and win the presidency. He had to win by 4 percentage points, which in today's world is almost a landslide. He had to win by 4 percentage points to assure himself the presidency. That is essentially an uneven electoral playing field. Again, this wasn't designed by the Republicans, but it leads to a bias in which the Republicans can govern us without building national majority. And eventually that's going to get us into trouble.
Can you reflect on what kind of trouble it might get us into? What are some of your scary scenarios?
Well, let me point to two pretty straightforward consequences. One is a legitimacy problem, right? When one party wins the popular vote, in a one-off scenario, like even 2000, Americans can shrug off a disjuncture between the popular vote and the presidential election. But if it happens consistently, people are going to begin to question the legitimacy of the system. So if you ask millennials or Gen Z, people who are younger than me, who have grown up in elections in the 21st century, whether U.S. elections seem fair to them, not really. In particular, Donald Trump, it looks like Donald Trump is going to lose this election by a collection of, 50, 60,000 votes. I mean, the difference in Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin is minuscule. So just, a slight shift in the weather pattern, right, and Trump could have won this election despite losing the popular vote by 4 points. And that didn't happen, obviously. But if it had happened, imagine a millennial who's lived through elections the last 20 years and sees the loser of the popular vote becoming president 3 times in 2 decades. That is bound to create a legitimacy crisis. That's one problem. The other problem is that parties that are too extreme and are potentially damagingly so need to adapt. They need to for democracy to be healthy, they need to de-radicalize. The Republican Party, by all measures, has become an extremist party in the last couple of decades. Democracy requires that parties be not be so intensely polarizing. So parties change course when they lose. There's no better incentive for party change than electoral defeat. And the problem with our institutions is that they dull the incentive for Republicans to adapt. So if the Republican Party really had to win 51% of the vote, not 47% of the vote, 51% of the vote, they had to win national majorities in order to take power, to govern the Senate, to have the presidency, they would behave in a different way. They would be they would be forced to become a more big tent party, a less extreme party. But because they can get by with only 47% of the vote and maintain the Senate and maintain control of the Supreme Court and frequently win the presidency without winning national majorities, they can remain fairly radicalized and have a weaker incentive to adapt. I think that also is going to be very damaging for our democracy in the years going forward.
You did point out in terms of this election, it could have gone worse, right? But it didn't.
Oh, yeah.
And, whether we're talking about vote counters or poll watchers or state and federal court systems, even the much maligned mail service, what you and Daniel Zablock call guardrails seems to have held. You use this phrase guardrails in your book, How Democracies Die, and you suggest that guardrails are absolutely vital for a healthy democracy. Can you help us understand a little bit more what you mean by guardrails?
Yeah, what we mean by guardrails are informal or unwritten rules that guide the behavior of politicians. So our Constitution is it's a brilliant document. It is one of the oldest, most successful constitutions on earth, but it's a very limited document. It's a short document. It doesn't actually say very much. It does not specify outside of certain areas exactly how we behave, how we run our elections, how we nominate our Supreme Court justices, how we regulate the relationship between the president and the Congress. There are a lot of things that are underspecified in the Constitution. So in order to make our very complicated democracy work, we depend on the self-restraint of politicians. We depend on politicians not going there and doing things that legally, constitutionally, they might be able to do. Just one example, we don't have really elaborate rules preventing presidents from enriching themselves in the White House, getting into the White House and using the power of the White House to make a buck or more than a buck. We've never needed that before, whether it's Reagan or Carter or George Bush Jr. or Clinton. None of those guys, whether you like them, dislike them, agree with them, disagree with them, none of those guys spent their time in the White House figuring out how to use the White House to make a buck. We could depend on their restraint. Not true under Trump. We may have to rewrite the rules post-Trump. Another area is just to go back in history, presidential term limits. For most of our history, we had no term limits on the presidency. The US president, our leaders, could be president for life, just like Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, just like Hugo Chavez was in Venezuela. It was the self-restraint of even powerful, popular presidents, Andrew Jackson, Ulysses Grant, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt. These guys restrained themselves, followed an unwritten rule, a precedent set by George Washington. This worked for 150 years. Only after FDR bashed through that in the 1940s did we reform the Constitution and establish a formal term limit. So this operates across the board. And let me give a couple of pertinent contemporary examples. Our election system is very localized. The whole process is run by local officials, mostly political appointees. Partisan appointees at the state level and the county level these are often Democrats or Republicans who have a fair amount of power in terms of decisions about who gets to vote, what's counted as a vote, what gets discarded. For 200 years, that's been okay. We relied on the fact that we expected appointed officials to do their jobs, that they would not work for their party, they wouldn't steal votes or operate in a biased way that would affect the count, that the parties wouldn't intervene and maybe refuse to certify outcomes because they don't like the result. We know that the Constitution allows, at least under some interpretations, state legislatures to send parallel electors, their own electors, to the Electoral College, even if their party didn't win the vote. These are things that can happen under the Constitution, and we've relied always on restraint, on the restraint of our parties and our politicians for that not to happen. And basically efforts to use the letter of the law to subvert the spirit of the law. There are signs now, even though none of that happened this time, there are signs that we're kind of in a dress rehearsal. That this, for the first time, some of this stuff is being considered. Politicians are learning that, maybe we can just refuse to certify the vote. Or maybe we can use our local officials, Lindsey Graham getting on the phone with the Republican official in Georgia, asking whether he can maybe throw out a bunch of mail-in ballots. Didn't go through with it, didn't get away with it. Lots of credit to the local electoral official who stood his ground and said that that's not the way we do things, but it could have been done differently. The state of Pennsylvania is not going to send parallel electors to the Electoral College, but they could, and it's been discussed now, and it's sort of on the table. So my fear is we are inching further and further away from the kind of restraint that we need to make this democracy work. And if either party goes all out to use the letter of the law, or to operate to the full extent of the law to win at any cost, we could be in some trouble.
So Barton Gellman wrote that widely read article in the Atlantic, "What if Trump refuses to concede?" And he said, Trump will not concede. Barton Gellman was correct. Donald Trump will not concede. That seems to illustrate one of the concerns about norms that you talk about in your book also, that it's not a law, but it's a norm. It is just what is expected in a campaign, that when you lose, you acknowledge your loss. And so this president has violated a universally practiced norm of conceding upon defeat. You and your co-author expressed concern about norm violations. Can you point to some other specific violations of norms by this president that have concerned you? And is it a Pandora's box? Once these norms have been violated, and you've mentioned it yourself earlier, a precedent has been set. Can we put Pandora back in the box, or is this a whole new game that we're looking at?
Yeah, I guess a few things. Donald Trump is a serial norm violator. He violates, and this is part of his electoral appeal. He's a populist, and populists are those who make a political living. They win their votes by thumbing their nose at the elite, at saying screw you to Harvard professors and NPR journalists and Beltway politicians. And they do that, one way of signaling that you're with the common man and not with the NPR journalists, is by violating norms. And this is a perfect fit for Trump's personality. So he violates norms that don't matter. Didn't bring a pet to the White House, things like that. But he also is perfectly able and willing to violate norms that matter a lot. We have norms about insulting our opponents, insulting citizens. Presidents don't normally insult people. He's insulted foreign leaders. He's insulted politicians. He's insulted journalists. In terms of the way he talks about race, we have certain norms that have developed, for better or worse, in the last half century that he was willing to violate, but also constitutional norms. I mean, he spent his whole, and we knew this, he spent his whole professional career in business always pressing up against the law, right? He would screw over a contractor and dare the contractor to take him to court because he had more money than the contractor and he knew that the person couldn't do it. He would push until he was taken to court, and if the courts told him to stop, then maybe he would stop. But that was his strategy. And so that's not a great strategy. You don't normally, if you care about democracy, you don't want a president who will abuse power until the Supreme Court tells him to stop, right? Lock up as many opponents until the Supreme Court tells you to stop. That's not a great, but that's his approach. And so we elected a populist who was a norm violator, and we got that. I think we're lucky to be where we are today, in that he hasn't done more damage. I think what really matters, though, is the parties. If it were just Trump and the two parties and our political and the media and all the people operating in our political universe today were pushing back against Trump and saying, that's not how we do things. This is unacceptable. I'm not going to support this. I'm not going to tolerate this. I think we'd be much better off. But the problem is that for the last 4 years, including these last 2 weeks, the Republican Party has been split between a group who are enthusiastically embracing his norm violations, a very small handful of politicians who are scolding them. So in many cases, it's a category of Mitt Romney and nobody else. And then a very large number of Republicans who are either hiding under the table or kind of half-heartedly supporting him, but who are not doing what must be done, which is stand up and very publicly, very clearly, very loudly say, you can't do this. Very, very few Republicans have been willing to do that, whether it's using the power of the presidency to try to bully a foreign leader into interfering in our elections, whether it's outright lying, whether it is threatening the media, whether it is declaring a national emergency to build a wall, even though Congress explicitly voted against it. There are a whole series of actions that in private, many Republicans were concerned about, that a handful of Republicans sort of signaled that they didn't love, but they were unwilling to forcefully denounce and break and say, we cannot accept this. And that's what's happening post-election, right? A very serious, as you pointed out, a very serious blow against our democratic norms, refusing to accept defeat, not only sort of muddling the transition process, but signaling to Republican voters, telling Republican voters, this wasn't a fair election. He won. It was stolen. This is a coup. We're not a democracy. He's telling Republicans, we are not a democracy because the election was not free and fair. It was stolen. And very few Republicans are coming out and saying forcefully, publicly, clearly, no, the election wasn't stolen. It was a free election. Biden won, and Trump needs to shut up and go home. And that's going to be very costly. So it's the behavior of the Republican Party as a whole, rather than Trump himself, that really keeps me up at night and it really worries me going forward.
And given the structural problems that you were talking about in terms of minority rule, the Republicans, in some sense, have no incentive to play hardball against their president. They don't need to. All they need is 46 or 47% of the vote.
Well, it's that and a couple of other things. One, Trump just happened to be extremely popular among Republicans. This has to do with sort of where the Republican base is at today, which we could talk about. But Trump was super popular among the base, and every single elected Republican official knew that. Every single Republican official knew that Trump was more popular than he or she was. Combine that with another factor, which is the institution of primaries. And these guys are really worried about their political future. Every one of these guys knew that they could suffer the political fate of Jeff Flake. They all watched Jeff Flake take on Trump and see what had been a bright, promising political career come to an end. Similar with Bob Corker in Tennessee. Lindsey Graham didn't want to be flaked. And this concern that knowing that if they go head to head with Trump, the Republican base will be with Trump, and knowing that primaries offer a way for Trump or Trump supporters to get back at them is what I think led most Republican politicians to either openly align with Trump, like Lindsey Graham, or just hide under the table.
So we've talked about guardrails, we've talked about norms. I'd like to talk one more time about legitimacy. You know, we all know people, perhaps even people in our own family, who not only question the outcome of the election, but they question the legitimacy of the election. If a sizable majority of the 73 million people who voted for Donald Trump, along with the Republican Party leadership, if they don't counter that view, that is, if they are either complicit or actively support the view that this election was illegitimate, are we at Lincoln's house divided?
We're at Lincoln's house divided, and we're at a place where it doesn't necessarily kill democracy, but it leaves us vulnerable. I mean, think about it as if you don't take care of your body and you're not getting enough sleep and you eat like crap and you're overweight, you're much more vulnerable to sickness than if you're healthy and you get enough sleep, etc. So our democracy won't necessarily be killed if 40% of the country believes that the election was stolen and that our electoral process doesn't work and that the Biden administration is not legitimate. We can survive that, but we become much more vulnerable because people who don't think, if you really do not think that our elections are fair, then you really don't think that we have a democracy. And so if somebody assaults that democracy, you're not going to care that much because what are you losing? It's already a stolen system, right? We've seen this in the region of the world that I study, which is Latin America, where institutions are not legitimate, where you don't have a consensus in society that not only we ought to have that kind of institution, and it works, and it's worth defending. If people don't buy into it, if they don't think the institution is worth anything, if they don't think it's legitimate, either they will support whether it's populist presidents or military coups that assault those institutions, or maybe they don't lift a finger when it happens, right? They just yawn, because what are you losing? If it's a corrupt system that doesn't work anyway, you're not going to fight for it. A healthy democracy is one in which people on both sides of the aisle believe in the institutions and will fight for those institutions.
Well, Professor Levitsky, you have given us a lot to chew on, some sober thoughts and reflections about where we are in terms of our democracy. I'd like to leave our time with one last question. Imagine this interview being like a time capsule, which we'll bury it today and then we'll reopen it in about 4 months' time in March and revisit it. What is one thought you want to leave us with now that we can kind of, when we come back on March the 8th, we can open it back up and say, this is what you said in November. What do you think now?
This is a political scientist's worst nightmare, to be held accountable for what they say before. Political scientists are pretty bad at predicting. That's a great question. I think what we need to watch for now is the degree to which the Republican Party accords legitimacy and a minimum of respect to the new Biden administration. Are they going to continue? I'm pretty sure. Here's one prediction I'm relatively certain about. I think Trump will leave, but he'll leave tweeting that this is a coup and the election was stolen. I think that's a pretty safe bet. The big question to watch over the next 4 months is what Republicans do with that. We will be in a healthier position if Republicans say, the states have certified the vote, the Electoral College has voted, this is ridiculous. Biden's the president. Congratulations, Mr. Biden. Trump's really got to shut up and go home. If the Republicans do that, we're not out of the woods, but we're in much better shape. If to the extent that Republicans either parrot Trump's language or continue this sort of half-hearted, yeah, Trump might be right, let's let him, let's humor Trump, but don't really firmly defend our institutions, because our institutions is what produced the Biden administration, right? And if you defend our institutions, you're defending the process that gave rise to President Biden. If the Republicans are either sort of half-hearted or continue to back Trump, I think we'll be in a much worse place.
Well, we look forward on Monday, March the 8th, to opening that time capsule up and saying, hey, Professor.
I'm in trouble. I think I'm going to get sick that day.
Thank you so much for the time you've given us. And for all who've watched, thank you. And come and join us on Monday, March the 8th, for the second part of this interview. Be well. Thank you. Professor, thank you again.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.